The news first emerged on Monday of a lawsuit against former Jaguars, now Commanders kicker Brandon McManus and the Jacksonville Jaguars, arising from an allegation of sexual assault by two flight attendants on a transatlantic flight that the Jaguars made in connection with their annual visit to London. I spent about 18 minutes yesterday laying out the big issues as the case begins the inevitably slow process of unfolding, barring a settlement that could happen at any time. These civil cases typically go 1 to 2 years, depending upon the court system, depending upon the issues that have to be litigated. A lot of the cases against the NFL, for example, end up languishing for months, if not years, over the question of whether or not it's even going to unfold in open court or will be forced into what I call the secret rigged kangaroo court of arbitration. I don't think that will be an issue here. I think they'll get right to it. So let's get right to it, because there's been some development since yesterday, and there's some information that I'm privy to that I don't think has been reported that I will be addressing later in today's segment. First and foremost, I've finally gotten a chance to review the actual complaint. It's not a long document. We have a link to it that will be posted at PFT, so you can read it for yourself and understand what it's all about. Now, the plaintiffs are residents of Harris County, Texas, which would explain how they ended up being represented by Tony Busby. That's the lawyer who had more than 20 plaintiffs in their lawsuits against Browns quarterback, then Texans quarterback Deshaun Watson, alleging sexual misconduct during massage sessions. That's how we came to know who Busby is and what he does. Now, look, it's a matter of style. Every lawyer has to come up with his or her own approach as to how cases are going to be handled. Busby tends to seek out publicity, and when you have higher profile defendants, publicity tends to be attracted. So, one of the very first allegations in the case makes it clear that these two individuals are residents of Harris County, Texas, which would explain how they ended up in a Houston lawyer's office, although given Busby's involvement in the Deshaun Watson cases, anyone from anywhere in the country could have potentially called him in a case involving the National Football League. So, the basic allegations, and there's always language in a complaint that is intended to attract attention, intended to raise eyebrows, intended to create some drama. It begins with this allegation, and the individuals have opted to keep their names secret for now. Remember, in the Deshaun Watson case, one of the fights was whether or not they would be allowed to continue under the Jane Doe pseudonym. The defendant apparently didn't even know the names of the individuals at first. And the reality for Deshaun Watson, as we learned, he was in the habit of having so many massages, he couldn't really keep track of who the people were who might have complaints against him. That was some of what we learned 3 years ago. In this case, probably easy for the Jaguars to figure out who the flight attendants were who were assigned to this trip to London from October of 2023. So Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2, flight attendants for Atlas Air Worldwide Holdings, were regular crew members on privately booked flights for National Football League teams. Both women previously enjoyed staffing NFL flights and found the players to be, for the most part, respectful and kind. On September 28, 2023, however, the Jaguars chartered a plane from Jacksonville, Florida to London, England. The flight was staffed by Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2. During this transatlantic flight, Jaguars kicker Brandon McManus sexually assaulted both plaintiffs. This case seeks damages in excess of $1 million against the defendants for the reprehensible conduct described in more detail below. That's how it kicks off. And everything after that is consistent with that allegation. There are some specifics in here. Some have been reported in public documents. Some we will mention in our PFT item. Again, we're going to put the link up to the lawsuit so you can read the whole thing. The gist of the argument is things got rowdy. It was a party. I don't think that the complaint specifically accuses the Jaguars players of having alcohol present, but it's obvious. It's obvious. When you talk about drinking, they're not talking about drinking water or Coke. They're talking about drink. They're talking about drinking alcohol. That, as I mentioned yesterday, is a major potential issue unrelated to whether or not anything happened that would be actionable involving the Jaguars or Brandon McManus. The NFL's alcohol policy could get the Jaguars in very hot water, given the memo that was sent 11 months earlier when there were two incidents that prompted the NFL to tell all teams there will be significant consequences for any future violations. That, standing alone, is a problem for the Jaguars if it can be shown that there was alcohol present on that flight. So, As expected, the complaint makes claims directly against Brandon McManus, where he's accused of, and the cause of action is assault and sexual assault by defendant Brandon McManus against the two plaintiffs. The second count, intentional infliction of emotional distress. It's not an uncommon claim. It's a high bar in a lot of jurisdictions to prove intentional infliction of emotional distress, but it's just another way, if you're going to go forward with a case like this, to make sure you catch every legal theory that potentially could unlock justice for the party that is seeking it. Count 3 is negligence against the Jaguars. And we mentioned this yesterday. The Jaguars have been sued because the argument is they failed to properly supervise McManus and they failed to properly protect the safety of the two individuals. And there are specific items of the things the Jaguars failed to do. Failed to properly hire McManus, failed to properly train McManus, failed to properly supervise McManus, failed to create and implement policies and procedures for hiring, training, supervising, and retaining qualified employees, failed to adopt policies and procedures for protecting flight staff from sexual misconduct by employees, failed to create a safe environment for staff serving the team, and failed to enforce a zero tolerance policy regarding inappropriate behavior. That's what lawyers do. They come up with every angle possible. Did the team do enough to ensure that what happened didn't happen? The fact that it happened would suggest that somebody failed to do something to prevent it from happening. Now, there's always a tension when it comes to making an argument that the employer was negligent when the individual did something that was intentionally wrong. What should the employer know or have known about the individual? What should have been done or could have been done? That's how the Jaguars get ensnared in this. So that'll play out in time. That's separate from whether or not Brandon McManus did anything wrong. It's possible he did something wrong, but the Jaguars aren't responsible because they can't prove the Jaguars were negligent. But the bottom line is, if something happened that shouldn't have happened on this flight, secured by the Jaguars, with players on the plane, coaches, staff, and others on the plane, and something like this occurs, it is fair to ask the question, did the Jaguars do enough to ensure that the individuals who would be exposed to these employees were properly safeguarded? So it's not a surprise. In a case like this, when events like this occur, you have the individual who did the thing or allegedly did the thing, and then you've got whoever might be responsible for that individual who are invited to the party. So, again, we'll post the full lawsuit at PFT, and we'll have further analysis of it there. A few other things, though, that happened yesterday. I mentioned that we now know that Busby is representing the plaintiffs in this case. That wasn't information that we had a day ago. Doug Pederson, coach of the Jaguars, spoke to reporters yesterday. And he had a few quotes that when I saw him say these things, it doesn't strike me as a denial. And he's on the plane. Now, these Atlas planes are apparently pretty large. They even use 747s, double-decker, where maybe you've got the coaches on one level and the players on another level, and the coaches don't know what's going on. But what Pederson said yesterday to reporters, I saw the article that came out. Obviously disappointing to hear the news that took place. Well, that's different from it didn't happen. My understanding is it didn't happen. My understanding is these allegations are false. My understanding is these events are not being properly characterized in the complaint. That struck me as kind of odd. Disappointing to hear the news that took place. It almost implies he's agreeing that it happened, that he's agreeing that there was a sexual assault by a former employee of the Jaguars. This is where PR and legal staff need to come together and make sure the messaging is properly communicated to the people who are talking to reporters and thus to the general public on a regular basis. Because the way he said it, man, disappointing to hear the news that took place. The argument's going to be it didn't take place. The argument's going to be nothing happened. The argument's going to be that this is, as Brandon McManus' lawyer said in the initial press release addressing the charges, this is fictitious, absolutely fictitious. Somehow that memo didn't make its way to Doug Pederson, who clearly didn't know anything about it. He said the first he heard of any of it was on Monday. So this wasn't something the Jaguars were told about. This wasn't something that Pederson was told about, and he said, disappointing to hear the news that took place. That's just not the way that you want your head coach, the guy who's in charge of the team, the guy who was basically the captain of the ship, other than the captain, literally, who was flying it. But he's the guy in charge of everyone on the plane when they're going from Jacksonville to London. For him to say, disappointed to hear the news that took place, Busby is going to seize on those words as some sort of an acknowledgement that there's merit to what the plaintiffs are alleging. Pederson was also asked about the allegation that there was a party atmosphere on the flight from Jacksonville to London. He said a typical flight is not that way. It's a business trip. And that's how we approached it from an organizational standpoint and from the league standpoint. So when I read that, that part was disappointing. Again, it feels like he's acknowledging it happened. It feels like he's admitting there was a party atmosphere. It feels like he's kind of washing his hands of all of it instead of saying it didn't happen. It's not true. And I don't know how far to read into any of this because I don't want to assume that Doug Pederson spent a lot of time coming up with a strategy for how to handle this. But it's almost like his attitude is, this ain't my mess. This isn't my thing. I'm not going to go out on a limb and preach the party line that this is fictitious and that these are lies and that this didn't happen. He's saying it's disappointing to hear the news that took place. He's saying when I read that part about a party atmosphere, that part was disappointing. This is a subtle thing, but I guarantee you, Tony Busby, on behalf of his clients, is going to try to find a way to make hay with this. Because this is at a minimum a crack. This is a separation. This is a way you can pit coach against former player and maybe coach against organization that may try to paint the picture that this is all made up. All right. This is the next topic. When Brandon McManus' lawyer issued a statement responding to the lawsuit on Monday night, the claim was made that this is absolutely fictitious, and it was characterized ultimately as an extortion attempt. And that made me think there was some effort to communicate with Brandon McManus about a potential settlement before the lawsuit was filed. My understanding, per multiple sources, roughly a week ago, there was a communication that was forwarded to McManus' agent, Drew Rosenhaus, inviting McManus to submit to a mediation, that no dollar amount was ever attached to this. It was just putting him on notice of the claims, and it was an invitation to participate in a mediation process. There was no acceptance of mediation. Instead, there was a request, my understanding is, for a demand, a specific number, even though the reaction by McManus' lawyer was these claims are false. No demand letter, no demand number, no specific amount was ever given. Instead, the lawsuit was filed. So, to the extent that this is being characterized as an extortion attempt, it's just clear to understand there wasn't a number given. And I think to the Dak Prescott case from earlier this offseason, he was asked for $100 million, which is one of the highest opening demands I've ever heard in any setting involving a civil claim between multiple individuals. $100 million is the kind of thing that's like, what are you talking about? That's like ridiculously high. In this case, there was no number that was given. This was the precursor to filing the lawsuit, which is what ultimately was done. My understanding is, and based upon the context of the complaint, even though the word alcohol isn't used, there was definitely alcohol on the plane, which gets back to the point I made earlier. The Jaguars have an issue here. They have a problem here, separate and apart from the claim that they negligently hired and supervised and provided or failed to provide a safe workplace for the two individuals. The alcohol on the plane is going to be a major problem for the Jaguars if the league truly intends to put teeth into the memo that was sent in November of 2022 after the issue with the Titans and former offensive coordinator Todd Downing, and then the Commanders flying back from Philadelphia with beer on the plane. That's what prompted the memo. That's what prompted the warning. And I know people with other teams are like, well, let's see what the league does, because they made it clear there's going to be serious issues if this happens again. Less than a year later, according to this lawsuit, and my understanding of what occurred, it happened again. Alcohol was on a team plane at a time when it clearly shouldn't be. Finally, the NFL, my understanding is, has already reached out to communicate with the two individuals who are making the claims, and what they have to decide is whether or not to cooperate. They can pursue their lawsuit and not cooperate with the league. They have no obligation. This is the big flaw with the NFL's personal conduct policy. The NFL can't force anyone who isn't employed by the league or any of its teams to cooperate. So, yeah, we'd like to investigate this. We'd like to potentially take action. Oh, you won't talk to us? Well, then they're forced to just monitor the case. They're forced to read the transcripts. They're forced to go to the trial. They're forced to get their information that way if they're going to take any action eventually against Brandon McManus or the Jacksonville Jaguars for violation of the personal conduct policy and related rules. So the NFL has expressed a desire to speak. That's my understanding. And the two individuals have yet to decide whether or not they're going to do it. Their lawyer, Tony Busby, will surely have some say in how that goes. One last point. I know I already said finally, but this is finally. This is the last thing that I want to say. I wrote this yesterday at PFT. Atlas Air is going to be a major player in this as it relates to evidence that is developed to either corroborate or debunk the claims. And one of the threshold questions, did they make a complaint to Atlas Air contemporaneously with this event? Because if they didn't, McManus and the Jaguars will argue, hey, if they didn't make a complaint to their employer through the normal channels, then that cuts against the credibility of this entire claim. Because if you had an issue and you have policies in place where you have any sort of inappropriate conduct being committed by the customers of Atlas Air, you communicate it to us so we can act accordingly. My understanding is, number one, they did make a complaint contemporaneous with the event. But I also believe that, and I haven't seen the complaints, and we may see the documents as the case unfolds, from the McManus perspective, from the Jaguars perspective, I think the argument's going to be the complaint as made with Atlas might not mesh with the content of the complaint that was filed last Friday night. And obviously, that's where somebody who's trying to prove that these things didn't occur will use conflicting versions to poke holes. And that will give, if nothing else, the lawyers fodder for aggressive questioning of the two individuals when it's time for their depositions to be taken, sworn deposition under oath, pre-trial, the opportunity to really test the claims, gather the information. And in this case, if there's two different versions that have been told, the lawyer's job will be, number one, to try to reconcile them, and number two, to make the case for an aggressive cross-examination at trial that these people can't be believed. And if you're representing the defendant, you want to come up with anything you can to prove to a jury that these people can't be believed. That's how you do your job. That's how you win your case. That's how this all works. It's an adversarial process where one side tries to prove up, the other side tries to prove down, and the jury ultimately figures out what it is that happened or didn't happen. So that's where this is all going to go. A lot of stuff to digest after only one day of developments. We'll continue to keep our eyes and ears open for more as it relates to this case, because there's a lot of different ways this can go. And there's a lot of different issues that will affect McManus, the Commanders, potentially his current employer, the Jaguars, his former employer, how the NFL handles it, whether it goes to trial, and if it does go to trial, what the outcome will be. Thanks, as always, for some of your time. We'll be back on Thursday morning with a new edition of PFT Live, and we will continue to do special editions of PFT PM as needed to keep you up to speed on what's happening with this case involving the Jaguars and Brandon McManus. Have a great rest of your day. Hi, it's Mike Florio. Thanks for watching PFT on YouTube. Hit subscribe for the latest news and analysis from Pro Football Talk.